The gunshot echoed through the canyon just as Thomas Walsh was about to pour his morning coffee, and he knew without question that someone was either hunting or dying on land that came too close to his claim for comfort. He set down the tin pot carefully, listening to the way sound traveled through these Colorado mountains, bouncing off red rock and pine until direction became a guessing game. Another shot cracked the dawn air, then silence settled back over the wilderness like dust after a stampede. Thomas grabbed his rifle from beside the door of his crude cabin, more from habit than fear. In 3 years of working this claim outside Fort Lyon, he had learned that prepared men lived longer than careless ones. The September morning in 1876 carried the kind of crisp cold that promised winter was not far behind. Thomas had been up since before first light, as he was every day, checking his sluice boxes and planning where to dig next in his endless search for the gold that would change his life. At 26 years old, he had spent nearly a decade chasing that dream across half the territories, from California to Nevada, and now here to Colorado, always believing the next pan would be the one to strike it rich. What he found instead was solitude. His claim sat in a narrow valley where a creek cut through granite and limestone, surrounded by forests so thick that some days he forgot what other human voices sounded like. He talked to himself, to his mule, to the ravens that watched him work with knowing eyes. The loneliness had weight to it, a physical thing that sat on his chest some nights and made sleep difficult despite the exhaustion that came from swinging a pick all day. Thomas moved quietly through the trees, following game trails he had memorized over countless trips to check his boundaries. The shots had come from the eastern edge of his claim, where the creek widened into a small clearing he sometimes used for hunting. His boots made soft sounds on the needle-covered ground, and morning mist clung to the low places, making the forest feel like something from a dream. He smelled the campfire before he saw it, wood smoke mixing with the scent of coffee and something cooking. Thomas slowed his approach, using the trees for cover, his finger resting carefully away from his rifle's trigger. Plenty of men would shoot first and apologize to a corpse later, especially if they were doing something they should not be doing on another man's claim. The clearing opened before him, and Thomas stopped so suddenly he almost stumbled. A woman stood beside a small fire, her back to him as she skinned a rabbit with practiced efficiency. A rifle leaned against a nearby tree, well within her reach, and a sturdy brown horse grazed at the clearing's edge, hobbled but healthy-looking. The woman wore men's clothing, trousers and a work shirt, with her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid that hung to the middle of her back. Thomas watched her work for a long moment, his mind trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Women did not camp alone in these mountains. They certainly did not shoot their own game and skin it with the easy confidence this one showed. He cleared his throat, deliberately loud, and saw her hand move toward the rifle before she turned to face him. "That's far enough," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. Her eyes were a striking green even from this distance, and her face carried the kind of beauty that Thomas had almost forgotten existed, tanned and strong-featured and completely alert. "I don't want trouble." "You're on my claim," Thomas said, keeping his rifle pointed at the ground but ready. "Been here how long?" "Since last night." She had not picked up her rifle, which Thomas took as a good sign, but her body remained coiled with readiness. "I didn't see any markers saying the land was claimed. Creek's the boundary. You're 100 yards past it." Thomas studied her more carefully, noting the quality of her gear, the good leather saddle visible on her horse, the way her boots were worn but well maintained. "You running from something," her jaw tightened. "Running towards something, there's a difference. Not much of one out here." Thomas finally lowered his rifle completely, propping it against his shoulder in a less threatening position. "Name's Thomas Walsh. I work the claim about a mile west of here." She seemed to relax slightly, though her wariness did not disappear. "Sarah Morrison, and I apologize for the trespass. I've been traveling for 2 weeks and I lost track of the markers." "2 weeks from where?" Sarah hesitated, and Thomas saw the calculation in her eyes, the decision about how much truth to offer a stranger. "Kansas," she said finally. "From a farm outside Dodge City that doesn't exist anymore." There was a story in those words, likely a painful one, but Thomas did not press. He had his own stories he preferred not to tell. Instead, he nodded toward the rabbit she had been working on. "That's good meat. You shoot it yourself." "I did." Pride colored her voice now. "My father taught me to hunt before I could read. Said a person who could feed themselves would never starve, no matter what else went wrong. Smart man. He was." The past tense hung in the air between them. Thomas made a decision then, the kind that came from instinct rather than logic. 3 years of talking to nobody but himself and a mule had worn thin the caution that might have kept him from inviting a strange woman to share coffee. "I've got a pot brewing back at my cabin. Better than what you can make over a campfire. If you're hungry for something more than rabbit, I've got beans and cornbread from yesterday." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Why would you offer that?" "Because I'm lonely, and you look like you could use a friend, and because talking to another person who might actually answer back seems worth the risk of you robbing me blind." Thomas surprised himself with the honesty, but it felt good to say it out loud. "Also, because if you're searching for something in these mountains, you should know what you're up against before you get yourself killed." "What makes you think I'm searching for something?" Thomas gestured at her gear, her deliberate setup. "Nobody camps rough for 2 weeks just to see the scenery. You've got good equipment, which means money, which means you could afford a hotel in Fort Lyon instead of sleeping on cold ground. You're here for a reason, and given that you're in gold country, I can guess what that reason might be." Sarah studied him for a long moment, and Thomas felt the weight of that green-eyed gaze like a physical thing. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "All right, coffee and conversation, but my rifle comes with me. Wouldn't expect anything else." They walked back to Thomas's cabin in silence, Sarah leading her horse and keeping a careful distance between them. Thomas found himself acutely aware of his appearance, 3 days without shaving, and his clothes stained with creek mud and rock dust. His cabin would not impress anyone either, a rough structure he had built himself from local timber, chinked with mud and moss, barely large enough for a bed, a stove, and a small table. But Sarah did not seem judgmental when they arrived. She tied her horse beside Thomas's mule, introducing herself to the animal with the same careful courtesy she had shown Thomas. The mule, usually stubborn and unfriendly, allowed her to scratch his ears without protest. "He likes you," Thomas said, surprised. "Old Jeremiah doesn't like anybody." "Animals know when you respect them." Sarah patted the mule's neck once more before following Thomas into the cabin. She set her rifle carefully against the wall near the door, close enough to grab but far enough to show trust. "This is well built. You do it yourself?" "Had to. Couldn't afford to hire help and couldn't work the claim while living in town." Thomas poured coffee into 2 tin cups, the good kind he saved for occasions that never came. "Took me most of a summer, and it leaks when the rain comes hard, but it keeps me alive through winter." Sarah accepted the coffee and wrapped her hands around the cup, breathing in the steam. Thomas cut thick slices of cornbread and ladled beans into wooden bowls, aware that his hands were shaking slightly. How long had it been since he sat across a table from someone? 6 months at least, since his last trip to Fort Lyon for supplies. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of focused eating that came from genuine hunger. Sarah had manners, Thomas noticed, but she did not pick at her food like some delicate flower. She ate like someone who understood the value of a good meal. "So," Thomas said finally, setting down his empty bowl, "you going to tell me what you're really doing out here, or do we keep dancing around it?" Sarah met his eyes over her coffee cup. "My father spent 10 years researching gold deposits in Colorado. He was a geologist, trained back east, and he believed there was a major vein somewhere in this region that nobody had found yet. He died 6 months ago, and my mother followed him 3 months after that. Before she passed, she told me where to find his research, all his maps and surveys and calculations. And you came out here to find it yourself." "I did." Her voice carried steel now, defensive against the doubt she clearly expected. "I know what men think about women prospecting. I have heard every opinion from Kansas to here, believe me. But that research represents my father's life work, and I am not about to let it die with him just because I wear skirts instead of trousers. Except you're wearing trousers now." Sarah's lips quirked in something almost like a smile. "Practical necessity. I learned quickly that traveling as a woman alone draws too much attention. Men either want to rescue you or ruin you, and I had no interest in either option." Thomas nodded slowly, processing this information. The loneliness that had driven him to invite her here now competed with something else, a spark of genuine interest that he had not felt in years. "Your father's research, it bring you to this specific area?" "It did." "According to his maps, there's a geological formation about 3 miles north of here, where 2 different types of rock meet in a way that should create ideal conditions for gold deposits. He called it the Sweetwater Formation, after the creek that runs through it." Thomas's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Sweetwater Creek, you know it." "Know it, Sarah, that's where my claim is." He set down his cup carefully, his mind racing. "I've been working Sweetwater Creek for 3 years, pulling enough gold to keep me fed, but never anything big. Never the kind of strike that would make it all worthwhile." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Describe the geology to me, the rock types, the way they layer." Thomas did his best, using language he had picked up from other miners, talking about quartz veins and granite shelves, and the way water cut through different densities of stone. Sarah listened with absolute focus, occasionally asking questions that showed she understood far more about geology than Thomas ever would. "You've been working the wrong section," she said finally, and there was excitement in her voice now, barely contained. "Based on what you're describing, you've been focusing on the creek bed itself, following the placer deposits downstream. But my father's research suggests the main vein would be in the hillside, where the granite meets the limestone. You would need to dig into the slope, not down into the water." "That's hard rock mining. I don't have equipment for that, just pans and a sluice box and enough blasting powder to make a few test holes." "I have money," Sarah said. "Enough to buy proper equipment. And I have my father's research, which is more valuable than any tool. What I don't have is a legal claim to the land or the experience to work it. You have both those things." Thomas understood where this was heading before she said it out loud. "You're proposing a partnership." "I am. Equal shares, equal work. You teach me what you know about mining, and I share everything my father discovered. We find the vein together, or we fail together, but either way it's honest and it's fair." It was crazy. Thomas knew that immediately, knew that partnering with a woman he had met an hour ago went against every sensible instinct he possessed. She could be lying about the research, or her father could have been wrong, or 1,000 other things could go sideways. Mining partnerships fell apart all the time, even between men who had known each other for years. But Thomas thought about the loneliness that had become his constant companion, about the way Sarah's presence had already made his crude cabin feel less empty, about the intelligence and determination he saw in her eyes. He thought about 3 years of backbreaking work with nothing to show for it, but enough gold dust to buy supplies and keep the claim active. He thought about the alternative, which was sending her away and going back to talking to his mule. Equal shares, he said. Equal work. And we put it in writing, legal and binding, so there's no confusion later. Sarah's face transformed with her smile, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the coffee. "We have a deal, Thomas Walsh." They shook hands across the table, her grip firm and calloused, a worker's hand that matched his own. Thomas realized he was still holding on a moment longer than necessary and released her, feeling heat rise in his face. "I'll need to see your father's research," he said, forcing his mind back to practical matters. "And we should ride out to the claim today while the light's good. I want to show you the whole operation, let you see what we're working with. Give me an hour to break camp and bring my gear here." Sarah stood, already moving with purpose. "I assume I can store my things in the cabin." Thomas looked around the small space, mentally calculating how 2 people and all their possessions would fit in a structure barely adequate for one. "It'll be tight, but yes. I can rig up a privacy curtain, give you your own space for sleeping and changing." "I appreciate that." Sarah picked up her rifle and paused at the door. "Thomas, thank you for taking a chance on me. I know it's not a small thing what you're doing." "Thank you for giving me a reason to try again," he replied, and meant it more than he could fully express. After Sarah left to gather her belongings, Thomas sat alone in his cabin and tried to process how completely his life had changed in the course of a single morning. Yesterday, he had been a lonely miner grinding away at a claim that yielded just enough to keep him hoping. Today, he had a partner, a beautiful woman with her father's research and money for equipment and eyes that seemed to see right through him. He stood and began clearing space, moving his few possessions to create room for Sarah's gear. As he worked, he caught himself humming, an old song his mother used to sing, and realized he could not remember the last time he had felt anything resembling happiness. Sarah returned within the hour, her camp broken down and packed with military efficiency. Together they loaded her supplies into the cabin, and Thomas rigged a rope across one corner with a heavy canvas tarp that could be pulled for privacy. It was not much, but Sarah seemed satisfied. "Show me the research," Thomas said, and Sarah pulled out a leather portfolio that had seen hard use but remained intact. Inside were dozens of pages covered in careful handwriting, sketches of rock formations, hand-drawn maps with elevation markers and geological notes, and calculations that Thomas could barely follow. "Your father was thorough," he said, awed by the scope of the work. "He was brilliant." Pride and grief mixed in Sarah's voice. He never got the recognition he deserved because he would not play the political games the academic world required. So he poured everything into independent research, always believing the next discovery would be the one that proved his theories. Thomas recognized that hope, the same desperate optimism that kept miners like him digging long after common sense said to quit. "What did your mother think of all this?" She loved him enough to support his dreams, even when they cost us everything else. Sarah traced one of the maps with her finger. "They were true partners in every sense. That is what I want, Thomas. Not just someone to work beside, but someone who understands that shared purpose matters more than traditional expectations." Her words carried weight beyond mining and business partnerships, though Thomas was not sure if Sarah realized it or if he was reading too much into them. He cleared his throat and focused on the maps. "All right, show me where your father marked the most promising locations." They spent the next hour going through the research, Sarah explaining her father's methodology while Thomas compared it to what he knew from working the claim. The more they talked, the more excited they both became. Sarah's father had identified 3 potential sites for hard rock mining, all within a half-mile of where Thomas had been working. "We should start with this one," Sarah said, pointing to a spot on the map marked with heavy ink. He rated it highest for probability based on the quartz indicators and the way the rock formations intersect. Thomas knew the location, a steep hillside thick with pine trees where he had never thought to dig because it was so far from the creek. "That's rough terrain. We will need to clear trees and build a level platform just to start digging. I'm not afraid of hard work. I'm starting to believe that." Thomas rolled up the maps carefully. "Let's ride out there now, see what we're dealing with before we start making specific plans." They saddled up, Sarah on her brown mare and Thomas on his mule, and headed into the mountains. The September day had warmed enough to make the riding pleasant, and Thomas found himself hyper-aware of Sarah's presence beside him. She rode well, comfortable in the saddle, her eyes constantly scanning the landscape with the alertness of someone accustomed to taking care of herself. The claim spread across a valley that followed Sweetwater Creek for nearly a mile, bounded by natural landmarks that Thomas had registered with the territorial office in Fort Lyon. He showed Sarah his existing operation, the sluice boxes he had built to separate gold from gravel, the various test holes he had dug and abandoned, the small lean-to where he stored his tools. "You have done good work here," Sarah said, examining his sluice with a professional eye. "This is well designed, efficient. You're getting as much gold as possible from the placer deposits. Just not enough deposits to make it worthwhile." Thomas kicked at the gravel. "Some weeks I pull an ounce, some weeks barely a quarter. It's enough to survive on, but not enough to build a future." Sarah nodded, understanding implicit in her expression. "Then let us find the source instead of the runoff. Show me the hillside." They rode upstream, climbing gradually as the creek narrowed and the valley walls steepened. The site Sarah's father had marked sat about halfway up the southern slope, where exposed rock showed the geological contact he had found so promising. Thomas had walked past this spot hundreds of times without really seeing it, focused on the water below rather than the stone above. Sarah dismounted and approached the rock face with reverence, running her hands over the stone like a lover's touch. "This is it," she breathed. "Look here, Thomas. See how the granite has this reddish tint where it meets the limestone. That's iron staining, which often occurs near gold deposits. And these quartz veins, they're exactly what my father described." Thomas tied the horses and joined her, trying to see what she saw. To him it looked like any other hillside, trees and rock and dirt, but Sarah's excitement was infectious. "How deep would we need to dig?" "No way to know without starting. Could be 10 feet, could be 50. She pulled out a small hammer from her saddlebag and chipped away a piece of the quartz, examining it closely. "But this is promising, very promising." They spent the rest of the afternoon at the site, Sarah taking samples, while Thomas mentally calculated what it would take to start a hard rock mining operation. They would need to clear a section of forest, build a platform and possibly a small shelter for the work, acquire picks and drills and additional blasting powder, and figure out how to remove the ore once they started extracting it. "It's going to take weeks just to set up," Thomas said as they rode back toward the cabin in the fading light. "And money, more than I have saved." "I brought $500, Sarah replied. "My parents' entire estate sold off to fund this venture." "It's everything I have in the world, Thomas. I'm betting it all on my father being right." $500 was more money than Thomas had seen in 5 years. It was also terrifyingly easy to spend in mining operations, where equipment failed and supplies cost double what they should and unexpected problems devoured budgets like water in desert sand. Then we better make it count. That night they ate together in the cabin, a simple meal of salt pork and beans that somehow tasted better shared. They talked about logistics and planning, but also about their lives before this moment. Thomas learned that Sarah was 24, that she had grown up helping her father with his research, that her mother had taught her to shoot after her father was nearly killed by claim jumpers in California. "I was 12 when that happened," Sarah said, staring into her coffee cup. "Watched my mother pick up a rifle and learn to protect our family because she could not count on anyone else to do it. That lesson stuck with me. My father died in a mine collapse when I was 14, Thomas offered. He spent his whole life digging for other men's profit, never had a claim of his own. I swore I would be different, that I would find my own strike and build something that belonged to me." "And have you found what you were looking for?" Thomas met her eyes across the table. "I think maybe I just did, just not in the way I expected." Sarah held his gaze for a long moment, and Thomas saw his own loneliness reflected back at him, the same hunger for connection that went deeper than gold or money or any material success. Then she smiled, soft and genuine, and Thomas felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. "We should get some sleep," Sarah said finally, standing to clear the dishes. "Tomorrow we start the real work." Thomas rigged the privacy curtain and tried not to think about the fact that Sarah was changing clothes just a few feet away, separated only by canvas. He lay in his narrow bed, listening to her movements, the rustle of fabric, the soft sound of her breathing as she settled in for the night. "Thomas," her voice came through the darkness. "Yeah, I'm glad I found your claim. Glad I found you. Me too, Sarah. Me too." The next weeks fell into a rhythm that felt almost natural despite its strangeness. They rose before dawn and worked until dark, Thomas teaching Sarah the physical labor of mining while she educated him on geology and ore identification. They cleared the hillside section by section, Thomas swinging an axe while Sarah hauled away branches. They built a level platform using timber and stone, creating a stable workspace on the steep slope. The work was brutal, harder than anything Thomas had done alone, because now he had someone to keep pace with, someone whose respect he wanted to earn. Sarah worked with relentless determination, never complaining about blistered hands or aching muscles, matching Thomas's effort with her own. She was stronger than she looked, with a wiry resilience that served her well. They made a trip to Fort Lyon for supplies, riding into town together and drawing stares from the locals who knew Thomas as a solitary figure. He introduced Sarah as his business partner, and while that raised eyebrows, the territorial recorder accepted their partnership agreement and registered Sarah's name alongside Thomas's on the claim. "People are going to talk," Sarah said as they loaded their purchases onto a rented wagon. "Let them talk." Thomas secured the last rope. "We're not doing anything wrong. We're not doing what they expect, which in their minds is the same thing." Thomas understood her point. A man and a woman living together without being married would be scandalous in polite society, though mining camps tended to be more flexible about such things. Still, he worried about Sarah's reputation, about whether their partnership would damage her standing in ways he could not protect her from. As if reading his thoughts, Sarah touched his arm. "I stopped caring what small minds think about me around the time I decided to come to Colorado. If someone has a problem with our arrangement, that is their burden to carry, not mine." The touch lingered longer than necessary, and Thomas found himself acutely aware of the warmth of her hand through his sleeve. They had been careful about physical contact, maintaining a professional distance even in the cramped quarters of the cabin. But moments like this kept happening, small breaches in the walls they had built, and Thomas was not sure anymore if he wanted those walls to stand. Back at the claim, they unloaded drilling equipment, a proper ore cart, reinforced picks, and enough blasting powder to make serious progress. Thomas had worked with explosives before, but never on this scale. Sarah's father's notes included detailed information about strategic blasting, how to fracture rock without collapsing tunnels or wasting ore. "We start drilling tomorrow," Thomas decided, examining their new equipment. "6 test holes in the pattern your father recommended. We'll see which direction gives us the best indicators before we commit to a main shaft." Agreed. Sarah was already studying the rock face, comparing it to her father's maps. "I think we should angle slightly northeast, following this quartz vein. It seems to widen as it goes deeper." They started drilling at first light, Thomas manning the heavy drill while Sarah cleared the rock dust and measured their progress. The work was tedious and exhausting, each hole requiring hours of labor to achieve the depth they needed. But Thomas found he did not mind, not with Sarah working beside him, her presence transforming the loneliness that had defined his previous years. They talked while they worked, sharing stories and dreams, learning the details of each other's lives. Thomas discovered that Sarah loved poetry, but pretended not to because her father thought it impractical. Sarah learned that Thomas had taught himself to read from his mother's Bible and still carried it in his pack, even though he rarely opened it anymore. "Why not?" Sarah asked, pausing to wipe sweat from her face. "Lost my faith somewhere along the way. Too many prayers that went unanswered, I guess." Thomas positioned the drill for another round. "Started to feel like I was talking to myself. I understand that. I prayed every day for my parents to live and they died anyway. But I still read sometimes, not because I believe in divine intervention, but because the words bring me comfort." "Is that strange?" "No. I think we all need comfort where we can find it." On the 5th day of drilling, as October wind brought the first real cold of approaching winter, they hit something that made the drill sing with a different tone. Thomas stopped immediately, his heart racing. "Sarah, hand me a chisel." He carefully cleared around the drill hole, chipping away rock until he could see what they had struck. A band of white quartz, shot through with dark inclusions that made Thomas's breath catch. He extracted a small piece and carried it into better light. "Is that what I think it is?" Sarah stood beside him, so close he could smell the clean scent of her hair beneath the rock dust. Thomas wet the stone and held it up, watching light reflect off tiny metallic flecks embedded in the quartz. "Gold. Not much, but it's definitely gold." Sarah's whoop of joy startled a nearby raven from its perch. She threw her arms around Thomas in spontaneous celebration, and he caught her without thinking, spinning her once before setting her down. They stood there, breathing hard, faces inches apart, the stone clutched between them. "We found it," Sarah whispered. "Thomas, we actually found it. We found indicators. The real vein could still be deeper or wider or nothing at all." But Thomas was grinning as he said it, hope blooming in his chest like spring flowers. "We need to blast now. Open up the rock and see what we're really dealing with." They spent the next day preparing the blast, drilling additional holes and packing them with powder according to the specifications Sarah's father had outlined. Thomas had never attempted anything this ambitious, and his hands shook slightly as he prepared the fuses. "We'll light them in sequence," he explained to Sarah. "Gives us time to get clear before the first one blows. And for God's sake, when I say run, you run." Don't look back, don't hesitate, just get behind that rock pile we marked as shelter. I'm not an idiot, Thomas. I know, but I need to say it anyway because if something happened to you, I could not live with myself. Sarah's expression softened. Nothing's going to happen to either of us. We're careful, we're smart, and we're together. That's enough. Thomas wished he had her confidence, but he lit the fuses with steady hands and grabbed Sarah's wrist as soon as the last one caught. They ran down the slope, boots sliding on loose rock, and dove behind their shelter just as the first charge detonated. The explosions came in rolling thunder, shaking the ground and filling the air with dust and smoke. Thomas covered Sarah's body with his own instinctively, protecting her from falling debris until the last echo faded and silence returned to the mountain. "Are you all right?" he asked, still pressed against her. "Yes. Thomas, let me up so I can see what we've done." Reluctantly he moved, and they stood together, coughing in the dust cloud that slowly cleared to reveal the hillside. The blast had opened a cavity in the rock face, exposing fresh stone and what looked like a continuation of the quartz vein they had found. They waited an hour for the dust to settle fully and the rock to stabilize, then approached cautiously with tools and lanterns. The opening was large enough to walk into if they stooped, and Thomas went first, holding his lantern high while Sarah followed close behind. "Look," she breathed, and Thomas turned to see what had caught her attention. The quartz vein ran through the exposed rock like a white river, and embedded throughout it were flecks and nuggets of gold, more than Thomas had ever seen in one place. It was not the massive deposit that dreams were made of, but it was real and substantial and exactly what Sarah's father had predicted they would find. "Your father was right," Thomas said, awe filling his voice. "Sarah, he was absolutely right." She was crying, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. "I wish he could see this. Wish both my parents could know that everything they sacrificed meant something." Thomas set down his lantern and pulled Sarah into his arms, holding her while she cried for her parents and their lost dreams that had become real too late for them to share. He stroked her hair and murmured wordless comfort, his own throat tight with emotion. When Sarah finally pulled back, she looked up at Thomas with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams since the first morning. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing in me, for taking a chance on my father's research, for being the partner I needed." "Thank you for finding me," Thomas replied, "for giving me a reason to hope again." They stood there in the half-light of the lanterns, surrounded by stone and gold and the product of their shared labor. Thomas knew he should step back, restore the professional distance they had maintained. Instead, he cupped Sarah's face in his rough hands and kissed her, gentle and questioning. Sarah answered by kissing him back, her arms going around his neck, her body pressing against his. The kiss deepened. Weeks of denied attraction finally given permission, and Thomas felt like he was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest. "I was starting to think you would never do that." "I was trying to be respectful, professional," Thomas laughed shakily. "Turns out I'm not very good at it, good. Because I have been wanting you to kiss me since about the third day we worked together, when you taught me how to use the sluice box and your hands covered mine, and I thought I might die if you did not touch me like you meant it." Thomas tilted her face up, needing to see her expression. "Sarah, I am not a rich man and I might never be despite this strike. I live in a cabin that leaks and eat beans most nights and my best friend is a mule. I don't have much to offer you. You have yourself, and that is everything I want." Sarah's smile was radiant even in the dim light. "I did not come to Colorado looking for wealth, Thomas. I came looking for purpose and maybe a place to belong. I found both when I found you." Thomas kissed her again, slower this time, savoring the taste of her and the miracle of her presence. When they finally left the newly opened shaft, they walked hand in hand back to the cabin, their partnership transformed into something deeper and infinitely more precious. That night, with the canvas curtain pulled back, Sarah moved her bedroll beside Thomas's, and they lay together talking in whispers about the future they might build. Thomas held her in his arms, marveling at how perfectly she fit against him, how natural it felt to share this space with another person after so many years alone. "Marry me," he said impulsively, the words coming from somewhere deep and certain. "I know it's fast and maybe crazy, but Sarah, I have never been more sure of anything. Marry me and let's build this life together as real partners in every way." Sarah was quiet for a moment, and Thomas's heart clenched with fear that he had moved too quickly, asked for too much. Then she shifted to look at him in the moonlight that filtered through gaps in the cabin walls. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Walsh, and we will build something wonderful together, something my parents would have been proud of." They sealed the promise with kisses that led to more, tentative explorations becoming passionate declarations, as they learned the geography of each other's bodies. Thomas had been with women before, hurried encounters that left him feeling more lonely than satisfied. This was different, sacred in a way he could not articulate, Sarah's soft gasps and the way she whispered his name transforming the act into something transcendent. Afterward, they lay tangled together, skin cooling in the mountain air, hearts still racing. Sarah traced patterns on Thomas's chest, her touch feather light. "I love you," she said. "I think I started falling in love with you that first morning when you offered me coffee instead of running me off your claim. You looked so lonely and so kind, and I thought maybe I had finally found someone who understood what it meant to search for something more than what life handed you. I love you too." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I did not know I was looking for you until you were standing in that clearing, and then suddenly everything made sense. All the years of wandering and searching, they brought me here so I could find you." They made plans in whispers, deciding to marry in Fort Lyon before winter made travel difficult, to keep working the claim while building a larger cabin that could house a family. Sarah wanted children eventually, and Thomas discovered he wanted that too, wanted to fill the silence of these mountains with laughter and life. The next weeks were a blur of activity. They worked the newly opened shaft carefully, extracting ore and processing it through a method Sarah's father had documented. The yield was better than either had hoped, enough gold to justify their investment and then some. They took samples to the assayer in Fort Lyon and received confirmation that they had found a viable deposit, substantial enough to work profitably for years if managed correctly. They married on a cold October morning in Fort Lyon, standing before a judge with two strangers as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she had purchased in town, and Thomas had gotten a haircut and shaved for the occasion. The ceremony was brief and completely legal, binding them together in the eyes of law and God. "You may kiss your bride," the judge intoned, and Thomas did, pouring all his love and hope into the kiss while Sarah smiled against his lips. They spent their wedding night in a hotel, a luxury after weeks of sharing a narrow bed in the cabin. Thomas made love to his wife slowly, reverently, learning what made her sigh and gasp, discovering the beauty of her body and the deeper beauty of her trust. Sarah was equally exploratory, her hands and mouth driving Thomas to heights of pleasure he had not known existed. In the morning, they bought supplies for winter and headed back to the claim as husband and wife, Thomas driving the wagon while Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his thigh in casual intimacy. Winter came hard and early to the Colorado mountains, snow falling in November and not letting up until March. They worked when weather permitted, but mostly they used the time to plan and dream. Thomas taught Sarah to play cards, and she taught him about geology and poetry, reading aloud while he carved furniture for the new cabin they would build come spring. They made love frequently, learning each other's rhythms, their passion deepening into something that felt as necessary as breathing. Thomas had never been so happy, even confined to the small cabin by snowdrifts that reached the windows. Sarah's presence transformed everything, her laughter and intelligence, and the way she looked at him like he was the answer to prayers she had stopped believing would be heard. In February, Sarah missed her monthly courses, and they realized she was pregnant. The news filled Thomas with equal parts joy and terror. He had seen women die in childbirth, knew the risks, especially this far from medical help. "We'll go to Fort Lyon when the time comes," he promised, holding Sarah close. "I won't risk you, not for anything. I'm strong, Thomas. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I'll be fine, and our child will be fine, and we will raise them to be brave and smart and kind." Sarah placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "This is what hope looks like, our future right here." Spring brought melting snow and the ability to work outside again. Thomas began building the new cabin, larger and better constructed, while Sarah continued processing ore from their winter excavation. She worked carefully, mindful of her growing pregnancy, and Thomas watched her like a hawk, ready to take over the moment she showed any signs of fatigue. The cabin took shape through April and May, Sarah helping when she could, offering design suggestions that improved on Thomas's original plans. They built it with windows to let in light, a proper stone fireplace, separate rooms for sleeping and living, and space for the children they hoped to have. By June, the cabin was habitable, and they moved their possessions from the old structure. Sarah was visibly pregnant now, her belly swelling with their child, and Thomas thought she had never been more beautiful. He told her so constantly, and she would laugh and kiss him and call him ridiculous before returning to whatever task she had set herself. They worked the claim through summer, extracting good yields and storing the gold carefully. Thomas calculated that they had pulled nearly $3,000 worth in the past year, an amount that seemed impossible after so many years of barely scraping by. Sarah's father's research had proven its value many times over. In late July, Sarah's pain started in the middle of the night. Thomas hitched the wagon in record time and drove through darkness toward Fort Lyon, Sarah breathing through contractions while he pushed the horses as fast as he dared. They made it to town by dawn, and the local doctor's wife, experienced in midwifery, took charge. Thomas waited outside the room, pacing and praying to the God he had stopped believing in, bargaining everything he had for Sarah's safety. The hours stretched endlessly, punctuated by sounds that made his heart race with fear. When a baby's cry finally pierced the air, Thomas nearly collapsed with relief. "You have a son," the midwife announced, opening the door with a smile. "Healthy and strong, just like his mother." Thomas entered the room to find Sarah propped up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "Meet your son, Thomas." He took the baby carefully, awed by the tiny perfection of this new life they had created. The infant had Sarah's nose and what looked like it might become Thomas's jaw, and eyes that blinked up at him with unfocused wonder. "He's perfect," Thomas whispered. "Sarah, he's absolutely perfect." They named him Daniel, after Sarah's father, giving him a middle name of James for Thomas's father. The baby thrived, growing strong on Sarah's milk, and the attention of two parents who could not believe their good fortune. They stayed in Fort Lyon for 2 weeks, letting Sarah recover fully before making the trip back to the claim. When they finally returned, it was as a family, Daniel sleeping peacefully while his parents resumed the life they were building together. The years that followed were not easy, but they were good. Thomas and Sarah worked the claim every season, pulling enough gold to build security and comfort. They hired help eventually, a young prospector named Ben, who had more ambition than luck, and taught him their methods in exchange for honest labor. Sarah had another child 3 years after Daniel, a daughter they named Charlotte after Thomas's mother. Then 2 years after that came another son, Michael, completing their family. The cabin rang with children's voices, and the loneliness that had once defined Thomas's life became a distant memory. They expanded their operation carefully, never overreaching, always mindful of the boom and bust cycles that destroyed so many mining ventures. Sarah's business sense proved as sharp as her geological knowledge, and together they built something sustainable and prosperous. Daniel grew tall and serious, fascinated by rocks and minerals like his grandfather had been. Charlotte was adventurous and fearless, climbing trees and riding horses before she could properly walk. Michael, the baby, had his mother's green eyes and his father's quiet determination. Thomas taught his children everything he knew about mining and survival, while Sarah educated them in geology, mathematics, and the literature she loved. They raised their family to value hard work and kindness, to respect the land that provided for them, and to never take for granted the love that bound them together. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Sarah back to the clearing where they had first met. It was autumn again, September morning crisp and clear, and the years had changed them both, but not the essential core of who they were to each other. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked, holding his wife close. "Leaving everything you knew to chase your father's dream, not for a single moment." Sarah tilted her face up to kiss him. "I found exactly what I was searching for, Thomas. Not gold, though that was nice, but purpose and partnership and a love I never imagined possible. You gave me everything I needed." "You saved me," Thomas said simply. "I was dying out here, too lonely and stubborn to admit it. Then you showed up with your father's maps and your fierce determination, and suddenly I remembered what it meant to be alive. I love you more now than the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." They stood together in the clearing, two people who had started as strangers and become everything to each other, their past struggles transformed into the foundation of a remarkable life. Around them, the Colorado mountains stood eternal and indifferent, but here in this small space they had carved out something precious and lasting. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. The claim they had worked together eventually played out, as all mines eventually do, but by then, Thomas and Sarah had diversified, investing in property and businesses in Fort Lyon. They never became wealthy by the standards of the mining barons who built mansions in Denver, but they achieved something more valuable: security, respect, and the deep satisfaction of work well done. Daniel followed his grandfather's path into geology, eventually teaching at a university back east and making discoveries that would have made Sarah's father proud. Charlotte married a rancher and raised horses on land outside Fort Lyon, her adventurous spirit finding expression in breaking wild mustangs and building her own legacy. Michael took over his parents' mining interests, working claims with the same careful attention to sustainability that Thomas and Sarah had practiced. Thomas and Sarah grew old together, their hands becoming gnarled with arthritis, but still reaching for each other in the night. They sat on the porch of the home they had built and watched grandchildren play in the yard, each generation a testament to the choice they had made to build a life together. On a spring morning in 1912, 36 years after they first met, Sarah passed away peacefully in her sleep, Thomas holding her hand as dawn light filtered through their bedroom window. She was 60 years old, and she left behind a legacy of love and determination that touched everyone who had known her. Thomas lived another 4 years, supported by his children and grandchildren, still sharp-minded even as his body failed. He spent his final years writing down the story of how he had found Sarah, how their partnership had transformed both their lives, how love had bloomed in the loneliest of places. On a summer evening in 1916, Thomas Walsh died in the same bed where his wife had passed, his last words a whispered declaration of love to the woman who had saved him 40 years earlier. He was 66 years old, and he died knowing he had found exactly what he had been searching for all those years ago. They buried him beside Sarah in the Fort Lyon Cemetery, beneath a headstone that read, "Partners in Life and Love." Their children and grandchildren stood together at the grave, sharing stories of two people who had taken a chance on each other when it would have been easier to walk away. The claim they had worked together was long since abandoned, reclaimed by forest and time. But sometimes, people said, if you walked those mountains in early morning, you could still feel the presence of two souls who had found each other against all odds, who had built something lasting from loneliness and hope. Their story became local legend, told and retold in Fort Lyon and the surrounding territory. The lonely miner who had been searching for gold and found love instead. The determined woman who had honored her father's research and discovered her own destiny. Two people searching for the same thing, though they had not known it until they found each other. And in the end, what they found was worth more than all the gold in Colorado. They found partnership and passion, family and purpose, and the kind of love that transforms loneliness into joy. They found home, not in a place but in each other, and that made all the difference.